Hello and welcome to episode 77 of the TRUUMAN Podcast, the podcast designed to create a generation of self-defined men. Today, I'm joined by Ross Anderson. Ross, it's an absolute pleasure. How are you doing today?
What's up? Good. Looking forward to getting into it.
Good. Now, as always, Ross, in your own words, what makes you a man?
Right off the bat, that is hard. Answering that now as a father is very different. If you'd asked me that question as a non-parent, what makes me a man? You've stumped me. I would say what makes me a man, I love the role of providing, protecting, guiding. I have a little daughter now, her name's Birdie. And, when you become a father, I feel like, society in a sense is, in some sense, maybe not all of society, but politically or however you want to look at it, I feel like there are forces trying to make males and females one and the same, when in fact they aren't. Hormonally, neurocortically, physiologically, we are different. And that becomes very apparent when you become a parent. As a father, you operate differently than, say, the mother does. And it's very natural. And I'm sure most mothers and fathers out there will agree. So I'm speaking now from answering your question from the perspective of father, because it has shifted my perspective. As I've become a father, I've become more worldly, more moral, more, or at least attempting to be more virtuous. So I guess to answer that question, I'm a provider, I'm someone who guides, I'm someone who protects, but being a father, I'm now become more worldly, and I don't just think about myself. I think about my immediate family, I think about my extended family, and I also think a lot more about the community. And I think as a man today, I have a duty to make the world a better place. And all these things that I've experienced in my life and that I'm learning, I have a responsibility, I have a duty to share those in a very non-biased way, not forcefully, just to put good energy, good knowledge, good insights out there, and hopefully, others can benefit them, and again, can make the world a better place. It's a really challenging question to ask. I wasn't even anticipating the question actually, but a challenging question to answer.
It is. I think the reason I ask it is because I don't think many men do ask it at any point in their life. I think it's a question that we just fall into those traditional societal roles and we never really think outside of that. I do think that maybe a change in circumstances like fatherhood does mean that you want to maybe question it a little bit more. Do you, just on that, because you did have quite a big pause, and I'm just interested on this because I like this question for that reason. What do you think the pause was for? Was it for thought, or was it for choosing your words carefully?
Thought. I'm not one for choosing my words carefully. What is it? I've never been asked the question. And I almost don't really. The question is valid, but I am just being me. I know that everyone is an independent entity, right? So, masculine, feminine. And again, we're neurocortically different, we're hormonally different. And so those parts we don't necessarily need to think about. I think that's embedded in our DNA. We operate in certain ways for a certain reason. If you look at my nephews, I have a ton of little nephews, males, and I have a little girl, and I have a lot of friends that have little girls and little boys. And it's very evident to me from the get-go that there are very obvious differences. Now, there are exceptions to those differences, but there are very obvious differences. My little girl loves to play with dollies. It just happens very naturally. She loves to play with dollies. She'll sit and play with dollies for hours. All my nephews, they couldn't be asked to play with dollies. And they like to roughhouse a little bit more, and they feel more physically robust. When you pick them up, they're heavier, they're more dense. So there's just these subtle differences that happen that I don't think you always have to think about them. I think you actually have to be fully connected with those natural compulsions and sensations within you, if that makes sense. But there is value and validity in asking a question like that too.
Yeah, I get.
Hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, for sure. I think for me, it's I think maybe you're past that concept where it's like you are an individual and you have your. So if I said what makes you individual, you probably would have answered that a lot easier than what makes you a man. But I think for a lot of men, they've never even thought about themselves as an individual. They are just part of a unit, and they have a role, and they've never really thought of their role in life, in their life. So that's the reason that I try and ask that question. And it's always great to hear other people's answers. But sort of on that, I guess, great segue into what it is that you do sort of in and around this space. What is you?
Sure. So, I mean, for the last 9 years, I've been operating as an independent speaker, trainer, and consultant, specializing in wellbeing science primarily, all things human flourishing. So, my background's in 4 forms of psychology: neuroscience, positive psychology, psychological disorders, and sleep psychology, and also all things blood work analysis and interpretation. Working with athletes, entrepreneurs, and organizations, small and large, so growth orientated startups, but also larger national and international organizations, the UFC, Dell Technologies, O2, Cisco Systems, and many, many more, helping them, I guess, a number of key services, short form, long form behavioral change programs. So most organizations that are looking to achieve their organizational goals, but then we also have to strip it back and look at the more human perspective. So they've got their goals and their KPIs, yes, but there is this group of people that is operating their organization, and they have human orientated challenges. You and I will get sick, friends and family will get significantly sick, we may lose a mother or a father, an aunt or an uncle, we may have children. So there's all these challenges that can compound and can impact performance. We have to be aware of that human-centered perspective. So I come in and I don't just offer knowledge, well-considered knowledge, to empower people, but it's all about helping these individuals make positive changes at the habitual level to ultimately improve performance. But I come at it more from a person-centered perspective. And we have, a CEO resilience program, helping CEOs get ahead without losing the head. That's more of like the professional side of me. I also do a lot of keynote speaking, 500 keynotes now in 180 countries, tapping into a variety of different topics. So it could be my story of transformation. What I'm sharing with you now sounds quite fanciful, but my life was very different many, many years ago. So people like to know. I'm no Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos by any means, but I've travelled quite the distance, and people like to know about that journey and those challenges. I've launched last year. I launched a new company, Beyond Baseline, which is all about meeting people where they're at psychologically and physiologically, and taking them beyond their baseline, not just to be free from disease and disorder, but to realise their fullest potential occupationally, athletically, entrepreneurially, and so on. And then a new arm of that just recently, Better Man.
Amazing. One of the things I want to sort of pick up on that is sort of, you talked about the human element of sort of CEOs and businesses sort of performing, and some of the life challenges that get thrown at, I guess, those to reach those positions. You tend to be a little bit older, so like you say, family loss and these things, and kids growing up. Obviously, a lot of men tend to be in those positions. That's just the way it is right now. What do you see is the main sort of puller for them to keep improving, but yet not focus on themselves, if that makes sense?
I guess the challenges for men are that they are way more one-pointed than females. So what we know about male psychology is that men are more front to back thinkers, one-pointed, and female are more global thinkers. So, oftentimes, and again, there's always exceptions, but, as a simple example of this, when we go on holiday, my other half and I, I'm pissing around trying to find my headphones, and she's got all the passports and everything organised, because we get locked in one particular thing. And men like to be solution focused. They like to achieve their goals, and it's very difficult for men to pursue something linearly and then bounce out of that and explore to separate and be present in these other domains of life, or be involved and engaged with these other domains and other projects in life.
So what are some of the, I guess, tips or tricks or things that you try to implement into these men to allow them to be a little bit more fuller, if you will.
A little bit more full, like more fulfilled.
Yeah.
I would say, I mean, there's ultimately a number of things. Some guys have different challenges. A lot of them, this speaks to, I guess, a broader issue in society, and that how we fulfill our happiness quota, you know. So 80% of society right now are fulfilling their happiness quota through raw sense pleasures. So, you've got the drugs, alcohol, sugar, a bowl of vanilla ice cream, a bar of chocolate, pornography, buying puppies or wee pug dogs as we call them in Scotland. Focus on what your work tops might look like, where you're going your next holiday, the fancy car. These things have raw sense pleasures. I'm not saying they're right nor wrong, but they bring feels, raw sense feels, but they're very fleeting. And very few people know about these other forms of happiness and fulfillment. And in psychology, there are two other forms. There is the engaged life, and there's a formula to achieve that. And if you think about the engaged life, what is the opposite of an engaged life? It's a disengaged life. It's an unfelt life. It's an unenthused life. Whereas an engaged life is you're fully engaged, you're enthused, you're enthralled by things, and it's more fulfilling. And the formula to achieve that is know your highest strengths and engage with them daily. And again, when you ask someone what their highest strengths are, they usually recite the bottom third of a CV or look at you dumbfounded. And we can go into that a bit further. And then arguably the most fulfilling form of happiness is the meaningful life. And there's actually a few paths to the meaningful life, but one formula is know your highest strengths, engage with them daily, but in service of something greater than you. So there's a lot of people that get caught up in work and they're just working. And you can fulfill some of your deep-rooted psychological needs through work, but there are these other things, these other forms of fulfillment. And again, most of society is fulfilling their happiness quota through raw sense pleasures. And I think it was Roosevelt that said the masses of men lead, males and females, masses of men lead lives of quiet desperation. And that's because they don't have access to the knowledge to be able to consciously fulfill their happiness quota in a more sustainable way, as opposed to, just always abusing these raw sense pleasures. So to answer your question, these gentlemen that can get so caught up in their work, it's likely that provides them some raw sense pleasure. Yeah. Dopamine, it's always a neurochemical, a catecholamine, it's always noted and referenced. But through their work, their goal-orientated behavior, they are releasing dopamine. The dopaminergic system produces dopamine. It's involved in reward and motivation. And so and it's triggered by two things, novelty and a perception of progress. So in work, there's a lot of novelty. There's sometimes a keen sense of progress. So you get that raw sense feel. But you need to be fully engaged in work all the time to feel that way. And if you aren't, then what happens is you feel unfulfilled because we don't know how to fulfill in a more sustainable, healthy manner, if that makes sense. So I usually help these gentlemen, these CEOs, these C-suites, these managers understand these other forms of fulfillment and how to access them.
Yeah, I mean,
that makes sense.
It makes sense to me. Yeah, I'm just going to try and summarize it, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. But it's essentially working on other parts of your life that, ironically, if that one thing does go, or you have to have a day off, or you're sick, that you can still feel good in yourself. So whether that's a relationship with your family, or whether that is doing a sport, or going to see some friends, or going to a concert, whatever it is, it's finding enjoyment in other parts of life. And I guess for those men, a lot of exploration. It's early days, right? They probably don't know what that even is for them. Like you said, looking blankly at you, don't know what that is. So
most people don't have a clue what their unique strengths are or their core genius. I didn't. I found psychology through a lot of unnecessary suffering. A little suffering is good, like the suffering that's attached to, a positive outcome, like a workout, for example. But there's a lot of unnecessary suffering going on there in the world. And I experienced a lot of that, and it encouraged me. I had a lot of questions, and I couldn't find the answers to those questions. And then I found psychology and the human mind, and the more and more I studied it, the more I immersed myself in it, it was like it was opening up rooms in my house that I didn't know existed, meaning it was shifting the lenses that I was seeing the world through, and which was thus in turn changing how I engaged with the world and showed up. So to touch on that, your strengths, your unique strengths, your core genius, your virtues in action are essentially a combination of what you've been born with combined with what you've been exposed to and experienced throughout life. And there's a whole psychological process that can enable you to unearth these things, and you can't have mine, Lewis, and I can't have yours.
So that's great. It sort of goes back to that uniqueness of man that we spoke about before. I've noticed that a lot of men that I speak to in this space that offer something or work with men in some way, shape or form have gone through some sort of transformation themselves. And like you said, this was off the back of something else. Do you want to sort of touch briefly on that story, on like how you sort of reached your bottom and then started to move back the right way?
Yeah, I want to answer that definitely, but there's this little thought in my head now, that question you initially asked me, and I think I want to touch on that just briefly. What is a man? I think a man is someone who is comfortable enough to know that he doesn't really know himself and is brave enough to go on a journey exploring who he is. So that was just within me there. I think the deeper we go, the more we know about ourselves, and the more we know, the quicker and further we'll grow, and more fulfilled we'll be. And as you walk the way is revealed, and I don't think, maybe there is some sort of like textbook, generic, universal answer to that question. But I think the answer that's on the tip of my tongue are more honest and authentic, for me at least, as a sample of one, is that it's a journey of exploration, and it's on you to explore who you are, become the experimenter, have an experimenter's ethos. You are a blank slate, a tabula rasa when you are born. So you're just venturing through life, understanding, experimenting, exploring, refining, reflecting, and you will know the answer to that question in time. That's why I found it difficult, because I feel like I know who I am, but I couldn't answer that question as, what is it to be a man? I think there's a biological thing that we can all sense that influences psychologically, but also there's like a deeper sense of self to that answer also. Anyway, I just wanted to put that out there before we get into my journey.
I'm glad. I enjoyed that. It was, it was.
You stumped me. You stumped me with the first question. I was like, I don't know how to answer that. So it took some while to ponder it. But, you want me to touch on the journey?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah. So again, I mentioned what I do now, registered member of the British Psychological Society, the European Union of Sleep, still contribute to Glasgow University Psychology and Neuroscience Department. You work with all these Fortune 500 organisations. It all sounds very nice and rolls off the tongue very positively. I'm sure you'll agree, Lewis. But it didn't always roll off the tongue so positively. It didn't always look good on paper, quite the antithesis. So I guess I'll maybe take you back into Ross's life, little Ross's life. No handkerchiefs will be pulled out, I promise. But it's important to know where I was. An unfortunate common story. My parents divorced when I was 4, and my father was in and out of my life until I was about 13, 14. And then ultimately he rejected myself and my sister. And that filled me with a lot of confusion, a lot of anger, a lot of rage. I had a lot of daddy issues. I've made peace with all of those now, but those sensations, those negative emotions definitely fueled the first third of that journey of progress to a degree. And anyway, in part as a result of that rejection, I acted up a lot, got into a lot of bother in school. I was on a behaviours card. I don't know if you have an equivalent in England, but I was on a behaviours card for unruly behaviour, where you'd be assigned an A for good behaviour or a C for bad behaviour. I was on a truancy card, although we call them a doggers card in Scotland, but that has other interesting connotations. Where I was, taking time off school, and my mother didn't know about that. I was also put in a drugs card as well in school for, I was caught multiple times selling, smoking drugs in school. And so, looking back now, I was born to be an entrepreneur, but the curriculum didn't teach entrepreneurship. It didn't teach enterprise skills. And while I had a lot of academic and athletic potential, I had a lot of misguided energy too. And, I left school unrealised. And that's where my drug dealing and drug taking intensified to where at 19, I took my first overdose. And that was an unintentional overdose. I was not trying to take my life. It was a result of me living a very toxic life. At 22, I took my second. And then in between that, I faced a host of additional challenges, namely panic disorder. So, I would imagine your listeners listening, and the likelihood is many of them will have experienced a panic attack. Panic disorder is the most acute form of anxiety one can experience. I felt as though I was dying. I was taking multiple heart attacks every single day. I was dying of these heart attacks. It was extremely terrifying. And I was put on a lorry load of medication for that. And then came, further issues, a plethora of painful autoimmune issues. And further to this, I lost friends to heroin, crime and suicide. And then you think things couldn't get much worse. At 22 and a half, 23, my lawyer turned to me and said, Ross, you're looking at 2 years in jail for this, and there isn't much I can do. Now, to give your listeners some context, the year prior to that, I had narrowly evaded jail. And in the years prior to that, a number of small to moderate offences had compounded. I had used all my get out of jail-free cards, as it were. And here I am, staring down the barrel of 2 years in jail.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. It's a lot to happen in a short period of time. When you said it, and then you went, I was 22. I was expecting a little bit more of a jump in the time frame there. So it's really interesting. What was your sort of journey out the other side? Was it a get out of jail free card, or did you spend some time? And what was the sort of next stages from there?
Yeah, so facing 2.5 years in jail, the lawyers told me, because of my past history, compounding of things, and what had gone on the year before, that was the minimum, that was the best that they could do for me. There was an event that was the straw that broke the camel's back. This was the best they could do. I went for a secondary opinion, a tertiary opinion, and the response from each of those lawyers was the same. However, the year prior, so there was 14 months before the court case came to fruition, and in that 14 months, I had started to make some positive changes in my life. Not because I needed to, even though I did, but genuinely because I wanted to. I'd been in this horrible relationship with this girl who was constantly pulling me back into the world of selling and taking drugs. She had a lot of stuff going on. Our father and mother were constantly cheating each other. Believe it or not, they were swingers. They were. The father was abusive. He was addicted to speed. It was a horrible environment to be in. She became bulimic, addicted to drugs, and ultimately, she and I were going back and forth, and I was completely in love with her, and I probably would have went back with her if it weren't for her getting pregnant to another guy. Broke my heart, but it was what I needed at the time. So then I enrolled in a social sciences course at Cumbernauld College. Shout out to Cumbernauld College. And that's when things started to change for me, because for the first time in my life, it created the conditions for me to flourish. For the longest time, I was just a product of my environment, and this environment, this educational environment, created the ample conditions to flourish. Just like a plant needs ample conditions, we as humans do too. And what I mean by that is I had never really had any male mentors in my life, any positive male role models. I had great love. I don't come from nothing. I don't come from much, but I don't come from nothing. I had the love of my mother and my grandmother, and one of my aunties. But the males that were in my life were alcoholics, drug addicts, womanizers, gamblers, wife beaters, or just suboptimal men. And when I went to Cumbernauld College, I met my 3 Mr. Miyagis. At least that's what I call them. Hopefully your listeners know the movie, The Karate Kid, and if you don't, the plot is there's this young guy who has, circumstantially not the best setup. He has a lot of self-limiting beliefs, and Mr. Miyagi, this Pat Morita, this wise sage, helps him transcend a lot of these circumstances and self-limiting beliefs and be so much more. So these 3 college lecturers, Dell, Stevie and Robert, my 3 Mr. Miyagis, they helped me transcend my circumstances and a lot of self-limiting beliefs. Why I'm just some wee guy from the back arse of nowhere. Why should I be studying psychology and philosophy of the mind? But again, through their words and actions, they helped me be so much more. And long story short, it was one of these courses where if you could apply yourself, if you could rise to the top 5 percentile of the class, you could gain access to university. And for me, given where I'm from. No one in my family has gone to college, never mind university. I know for many it's a given path, but from where I'm from, that's not it's not such a common place. And they encouraged me to apply to go to university. They encouraged me to stand up on stage and talk about my issues with drugs and mental illness. I started an after hours group talking about my love for psychology. I fully immersed myself in psychology, and I gained access to Glasgow University. But the joy was short-lived, because I'm in Glasgow University 1 month and the court case was upon me. And ultimately, I don't remember much about the months and the weeks leading up to that court case, but I do very clearly remember that day in court. You know, my bags were packed, all my family were there, waiting to, I guess, see what my fate would be. And court starts at 9. I'm not seen to the very last person to be seen at 4 p.m. And then eventually the magistrate calls me up, Ross Anderson, and I walk up, and she's, you know, talking about all the circumstances that led to me being there, but I'm off in the distance, you know, thinking, how on earth did it come to this? Yeah. You know, was it because my dad left and rejected me? Was it because I come from a single parent family, low socioeconomic status background, not really having the conditions to flourish? And while all those things, I do realise that all those things do play a significant role, it wasn't the complete picture. In that moment, I'm realising that it wasn't just the external forces, it was how I'd been living my life internally. I think for the first time in my life, I was fully self-aware. Lights were on for the longest time, but no one was home. And in this moment, it was like I woke up. You know, how do I explain it? Life was happening to me, not for me. I was always in the passenger seat, not the driver's seat. And as I'm having that moment of realisation, the magistrate's voice snapped me back into reality. And she said 3 words that me, nor my family or my lawyer anticipated hearing. She said, fortunately this time. And I couldn't fathom why she'd given me a second chance. I couldn't fathom why she'd said those words, fortunately this time. You know, and I had to deal with a lorry load of consequences: denied access to America, wearing a tag, probation, several hundred hours community service. I was put in a list. They put me in this list. I wanted to work with vulnerable adults and kids at the time, at least. And they denied me and put me in this list, which makes you sound like some sort of bloody paedophile, which I had to combat that for years. But, you know, it was far better than the alternative. And so 6 months later, I found out exactly why I hadn't gone to jail for what was, by the way, a fight that broke out, and some people injured me and I injured some people. It turns out that those 3 Mr. Miyagi's, Dell, Stevie and Robert, those college lecturers, unbeknownst to me, each wrote individual letters to the magistrate, and that was the very thing that prevented me from going to jail for 2.5 years. So forever grateful to those individuals. And that was, on that day in court, I was able to make a new pact with myself to go on a mission to learn as much as I possibly could about how to navigate this world as best I could. And I thrust myself into the studies of psychology, wellbeing science and human flourishing.
You had obviously gone on that path of education and started to sort of take a little bit of self-responsibility, shall we say. Do you think also maybe that sort of came to light in when that sort of flick of that switch where you were just thinking about everything and then it just sort of hit you, was like, there is all this stuff that's happened to me and it is unfortunate and all of this has unfolded, but right now it's me as an individual that is sat here and now I have to take responsibility for that? Was there almost like a I'm now in charge switch?
I think if you look at most people in life, so how old are you, Lewis?
33.
Right. I don't know about you, but maybe you can speak to this, but I found that the more conversations I have with people, you know, whether I'm on stage speaking, we have conversations post-keynote with friends, family members, peers, connections. There's something that happens and there's some neuroscience to add some validity to this, right? But there's something that happens subjectively. It happened with me, and I'm seeing that observation in others too. There's something interesting that happens between the age of 22 and 24, where people become more reflective. Sometimes it takes a small event for them to awaken and start reflecting on life. Sometimes it's a bigger event, but I find there's something really unique about that period between 21 to 24, whether it's people have experienced enough hardship in life where they start to think, I need to change my life up. I don't like the way this is going. And they start to awaken. But there's also some neuroscience that supports that the brain isn't fully developed until 21 to 24. But I often find the conversations I have with people, they all start to begin that awakening process between 21 and 24, and they start to ask questions of themselves. And I think, you know, if you want to change the quality of your life, you have to ask yourself quality questions. The quality of your the questions you ask yourself, in my opinion, changes the quality of your life. If you ask yourself questions you've never asked before, you're going to get responses you've never experienced before, and that's your data to dig into, your knowledge for navigation. So I think, you know, for me, it was probably an event that triggered that. Yeah. For some people, it's maybe just less of a serious event and more of a compounding by default of them having amassed 21 to 24 years on this earth. They've compounded enough experience to think to themselves, do you know what? You know, I'm not really keen on the path that my life's going on. And maybe that's coupled with some neurological development, but I'm not keen on the path that this life is going. I want to direct my life a little here. And it's almost like they switch on their more conscious dashboard as opposed to their unconscious dashboard that's been shaped by all these external forces.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I left my job in finance at 24, so maybe that was the subconscious side of it. I'm not too sure. I personally had a large event happen to me in my 30s, like when I was 30, which has taken me on this journey. And I think a lot of men go through that as well. I think it's the modern midlife crisis, if you will, or the modern midpoint where we start to reflect and decide, well, what is this all about? Legacy and all of those things. And maybe not so Porsche driven and fast women kind of midlife crisis.
And listen, maybe it is just hardship. Maybe there's and each and every individual, there's a certain level of hardship that needs to be experienced, that needs to be fulfilled before we wake the fuck up and start to live a more conscious, self-directed life.
Your hardship meter needs to break over before.
And maybe my hardship meter just was like bam early on, you know. And maybe for some people, because of maybe they were born into two parents, maybe, you know, they lived a more privileged life in a sense, just through luck. And it takes them maybe to their 30, maybe to their 40, who knows? But there's a conversation to be had there too.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely life thing. I think one of my things that maybe we'll sort of lean into what you do right now as well is that we have a lot of boys in men's bodies. So these big things that happen is really effective to them. So they may go through all their whole life. They may get a decent job. They may get a wife. They may have kids. Kids may grow up, go to university, and then the wife leaves them. And then that's the end of their world because it's been so comfortable for them that they've never really had any challenges or anything that's allowed them to build resilience. And I think going through hardship builds resilience. I think you can mimic some sort of resilience building, but hardship is the shortcut to fast resilience. Right?
You know, you're right. And just this past weekend, I don't know if you're much of a mixed martial arts fan. I am hugely. I was watching the UFC this past weekend and Alexander Volkanovski won his belt again at 36. In the featherweight division, and in his Octagon interview, he said adversity is a privilege, and with the right mindset, adversity can fuel a lot of success. And I wonder, given what we're discussing here, you know, adversity is key, and a lot of these, as you call them, how did you reference them?
Boys and men's bodies.
Boys and men's bodies. These boys and men's bodies. Maybe, you know, 50%, I think, statistically speaking, 50% of the UK right now are single parent families. Most of those, probably 99% of those single parent families will be, you know, governed or directed or, you know, guided by a mother. And what I've noticed is that men, being, you know, having a child myself, men are far better at taking a step back and allowing their child, whether a boy or a girl, to go through some adversity, whereas females, because they're so sensitive, I say they're so sensitive because they're not so sensitive, you know, I'm probably more sensitive than my missus, but what I mean by that is because they're more by default. What are women more by default? They're just, how do I explain this? What I've noticed in my other half, Faye, is that if my little girl, for example, goes to gymnastics, I will allow her to fall and injure herself to learn a lesson, more comfortably. It won't bother me or perturb me the same way it will bother my other half, Faye, and bother her and perturb her. And that's across the board, in my opinion. And I think if you look at mothers will mollycoddle young men. They will wrap them up in, a protective blanket, more so than a father would, whether they're male or a female child. And I think that speaks to the value of yin and yang, having a mother and a father. And what you're seeing now is, I think it's 52% of UK households are single parent families with mums at the helm, and they're maybe mollycoddling these young men to the point where they're not experiencing enough adversity. And adversity is what we're discussing. Adversity seems to be one of the keys to unlock self-driven males, agents of action, those that can stand up on their own 2 feet and fend for themselves. So, and culturally, if you look at like the Maasai and the Hedza and the North American Indians, they would have had that. They would have, the young males and the females, especially young males, would have went out with the elders, if you will, and they would have had to, there's these rituals they would have to go through to, I guess, summon that adversity, or to put them in that adverse situation to unlock their masculine potential, or to unlock certain areas in their mind in order to enable them to mature. I waffled my way through that point, but
no, it's good. I agree with it as well. I think adversity is important. I think there can be controlled adversity and controlled resilience building. I don't say everyone should go through the ringer to get through, to create the montage, if you will. You can do that, but you do see it. You see My Little Prince, You're So Handsome, etc., etc. And that's not the real world, right? Like you're not a little prince in the real world, no matter how much your mom says it to be.
I think for me, I was forced out my home when I was in my early 20s, and that was a great thing for me. So my mother remarried an my stepfather, who's now not my stepfather, but my mother remarried, and he was an ex-SAS soldier with PTSD issues, who was an alcoholic and had a lot of family baggage, and he took to my sister but didn't take to me at all. There's only room for one alpha in the household. So just speaking about adversity, I was being mollycoddled to a degree. I was raised with a lot of women. I had a lot of love. Yeah. Granted, my mother had to be a mother and a father, and my mum, I've seen my mum in full-on fights, and so she has quite a balanced masculine and feminine traits, even though she's very physically beautiful. At the age of 30 or 40, I've actually seen my mum stick the head in another man, believe it or not. Maybe that's just my environment. But to my point here, growing up, I lived in quite a traumatic, there was a period of my life in my early 20s where I lived, it was quite a traumatic household. I was exposed to mental and physical abuse at the hands of my stepfather, and I couldn't handle it anymore. And I felt that I'd lost my mother. I'd already been rejected by my father. I felt that I'd been rejected by my mother, or I'd lost my mum. And so I left. I was forced to leave, right? Because I couldn't handle it anymore. But that was great for me, because it taught me to stand on my own 2 feet. It taught me, I had to go and get a house. I had to pay bills. I had to be responsible for me fully. I wasn't relying on taking handouts from my mother and not paying rent, or paying rent sometimes. It's a full responsibility, and I was on my own. And that was painful for a period of time. But adversity is a privilege. Adversity seems to be a key requirement for growth. Now, unfortunately, I don't think you have to go through my experience to get there, but there's something in that, because I think that was the point when I truly started to become a man. When I left my house, I went away, I travelled to Madrid to come back, I moved into a flat, I was studying at Glasgow University, I had multiple jobs, I started my business, so on and so forth. So I really don't know if I would be where I'm at if I hadn't experienced that.
For sure. And I think a lot of men either go through that or make a realization and want to, well, they go 2 ways, right? And I think the second way that we're going to touch on now, which is sort of encompassing what your businesses do now, right? Which is they make a decision that they want to get better and that they want to improve and that they want to excel past this point. They've realized that they are where they are. Maybe they've been treading water. So why don't you touch a little bit on what it is that you sort of do now in your businesses to sort of accelerate men past their potential?
Accelerate past their baseline, I guess, is what you were going with. Yeah.
I didn't want to plug you.
Yeah. So, my whole business, Beyond Baseline, is about helping males and females, right? I've noted a note something to come back to, but Beyond Baseline is about meeting people where they're at and taking them beyond their baseline, male or female. One component of that is Better Man, which we'll get to in a moment. But, my goal is to teach people, is to help 1 million lives. It's to teach people that, I can't believe how much I had to suffer to find the answers to the questions I had. So I look, less than 5% of our global Western curriculum is dedicated to health, well-being, science, human flourishing, psychology. So it's no wonder we're, suffering unnecessarily, or we're just failing to realize our potential. Because awareness is step one in the transformational process, right? And you only know what you know. So I believe I want everyone to understand, first, if you want to optimize someone's psychology, you have to optimize their biological fundamentals. You have to dial in how they eat, how they move, and how they sleep. And the eating piece is kind of complex, right? Because there's no one perfect diet, but there is one imperfect diet, the standard adult diet, the SAD diet, the typical Western diet. You can argue a lot about diet, but really there's only two indisputable facts. Western diet causes disease, and any culture that has preserved its traditional nutritional approach is free from Western disease. That's literally, there's a lot that can be argued, but those two facts are indisputable. But ultimately, you want to have that experimenter's ethos, do something and make the connection between the habit and how it makes you feel, subjectively and also objectively with blood work and some health testing. But ultimately, dialing in your biological fundamentals, how you eat, how you sleep, and how you move. And there's levels to that. But if you do that already, you are moving up the emotional landscape. I believe everyone exists somewhere on the emotional landscape in the physiological plane, -10 + 10, -10 + 10. And you want to make your highs higher on the physiological plane in the emotional landscape and your lows less low. And so after you start to dial in your psychological fundamentals, your biological fundamentals, you want to then look at your psychology. I asked the question, as I mentioned earlier on, I've delivered 500 keynotes to average audience sizes of a few hundred. That's tens upon tens of thousands of people. And I asked this question over and over again. Who in here does some form of physical training? Who in here does some form of physical training? Yoga, Pilates, high rocks, CrossFit, spin, MMA, boxing, tennis, whatever it may be, even speed walking. And on average, about 60 to 70% of the room will raise their hands, and I have them look around. And then I ask the follow-up question, who in here does some form of mental training? And no matter where I ask that question, when I ask that question, to whom I ask that question, the response is the same. On average, 2 to 5% of any room will raise their hand. Quite the disparity. But the problem here is that if you want to realize your fullest potential, if you want to be more, have more, do more, mental training is a should. It's a must. And 100% of our lives is lived through our minds, but yet only 2 to 5% of people are training their minds. So they're leaving a lot of potential points on the table there. And so I look at the biological side to optimize people, but then also the psychological side. There are so many forms of mental training. There's so many associated practices and corresponding benefits. And again, they unlock rooms in your house that you didn't know existed. They shift your perspective. And it's painful to me that few people have an awareness of these methodologies and interventions to unlock these positive mental ends, more gratitude, more love, more meaning, more purpose, more fulfillment, more calmness, more contentment, more mental toughness and resilience, more motivation, sustained motivation. But they just don't have, unlike a lot of people have keen awareness about when it comes to the physical exercises and routines and practices to unlock these plethora of positive physical ends, more strength, more flexibility, and more endurance. but they don't have the same level of awareness when it comes to the psychological practices to unlock those psychological benefits.
What would be one practice that you wish more people did, even if it was just the simplest thing that they could do?
There's two that come to mind, if I could share two. Number one is, I said that think of mental training as like the umbrella term. Then there's forms of mental training. Then there's their associated practices and their corresponding benefits. One form of mental training my favorite form of mental training is self-awareness, know thyself. And again, we touched on it earlier. When you ask people what their strengths are, they recite the bottom third of a CV, or they look at you dumbfounded. If you ask someone, what fires you up, what elates you, what excites you, because most people don't really know. Well, if they can't answer that, how can they be expected to target, chase, and fulfill those things? And so I just don't think people know who they are. But again, I don't say that judgmentally, because I didn't till I explored psychology. You know to a degree, superficially, you have likes and dislikes, but I'm talking about who you are at your core, strengths, virtues, weaknesses, what fires you up and thrills you and excites you, who you are in this situation, who you are in that situation. A question we mentioned, we were having a chat before we kicked off today. I'm a big believer that the quality of the questions you ask yourself determines the quality of your life. If you ask yourself questions you've never been asked before, you're going to get responses you've never had. And I've got all these different questions I like to ask myself and other people to elicit responses, because then they can dig into that and it usually unlocks something in their mind. For example, if I ask someone, who are they beyond fitness? Who are they beyond fitness? Who are they beyond their role as a parent or guardian? Who are they beyond alcohol? Who are they beyond their work life? Because these are areas of life that we get caught up in, and they can provide us meaning and purpose and growth in a sense. Maybe, there's argument with regards to alcohol there, but they can provide some benefits. But we can get so locked in, we can get so caught up in them that we prevent ourselves from developing a keen sense of ourselves beyond those things. And when those things are then taken away, we find ourselves in a real problematic situation. Case in point, my mother. My mother she found meaning and purpose accidentally, one of her deepest rooted psychological needs. She became a mother. She became mother of Ross and Abby at a very young age, 22. She had me at 19 or 20. And she was accidentally a mother. She accidentally had this sense of meaning and purpose. Now, she then, for the next 2 decades, was Ross and Abby's mother. And she wasn't developing a keen sense of herself. And then we flew the nest. We fled. We done our own thing. And then what she was left with was this void, because she hadn't developed a keen sense of herself beyond her role as a parent and guardian. And so that was contributory to my mother's psychological downfall. We all exist somewhere in an emotional landscape in a physiological plane, plus 10 and negative 10. My mother started to substantially slide down the emotional landscape, and she had a mental breakdown, and that significantly influenced that, not having that sense of meaning, purpose, motherhood or fatherhood can offer you. So, questions. Who are you beyond fitness? People get caught up in fitness and they don't have a life beyond that. Who are you beyond alcohol? Who are you beyond your role and your work, your career? And who are you beyond your role as a parent and a guardian? Pondering that can be quite uncomfortable for a lot of people. And that's what I mean by self-awareness. Really understanding who you are. People meet me and they say, I don't mean this cockily, the last Ross, you're really calm, you're really confident. And I would say, because I know myself biologically and psychologically and spiritually with depth. And so I think, to answer that question again at the beginning, it really is, a man he has to really explore himself to find out who he really is, who he is as a person and who he is as a man. And only he can answer that question. That's probably a better way of framing it. But mental training and particular self-awareness is something that I would have people explore. We're all very unique. You're different than I, and I'm different than you. And the more we can dial into that uniqueness, the more we can be fulfilled and we can add value to the world around us.
For sure. I think, to summarize, it's just a case of building up blocks, building up exploration, try and create you as a whole person. Don't have one thing that is your whole life. Make it everything a part of your life, and you'll live a more fulfilled life, and you can start to build on those things. But if you then really want to accelerate it, it's building blocks again. So looking at your diet, looking at your fitness, and looking at your your mental fitness to really start to accelerate that further. So I guess sort of on that, why don't you tell us a little bit about Better Man?
Yeah, so again, you're asking these questions. I don't know everything. I know a lot about little, and I don't always have the answers. And I wanted to fly by the seat of my pants today a little bit, and I didn't want to rehearse anything with you or script anything. But Better Man ultimately is, it's born out of, it's a community, and a yearly retreat right now, but we're going to evolve it. But ultimately, it was born out of, selfishness, in a sense. When I moved away from pub culture and party boy lifestyle, and I became a father, a businessman, a leader, in a sense, those things were consuming, at times all consuming, and I would accidentally and unintentionally isolate myself and at times feel lonely. And as I opened up, and that doesn't feel too nice, and as I opened up about that, other men would express similar sentiment. And so that was the first, there's something in this here. There's a lot of loneliness and we want to curb that. You only need to look around to see that there's a dip in resilience in modern men. And, I'm talking about my personal experience here too. I look at my friends. And that was something, again, the emotional energy of men is flatlining. There's a dip in resilience. They're lonely. I want to curb that. But then also, if you look at the standard of modern man in the UK, working class, middle class man in the UK right now, it's, in my opinion, I don't think it's where it needs to be. I think it can be elevated, and I want to play a part in that. I want to impact that. I've got a daughter. Again, selfishly, I'm going to marry her off. I don't want to marry her off to a Wally or a Plonker. I've got nephews between the ages of 1 and 10. I may have more children, whether it's a female or a male. I want them to be exposed to the best people they possibly can be, and I want them to be the best they possibly can be. And I'm also thinking about other friends and extended community. Again, becoming a father, you think more worldly. And so there's some of that there, right? I want to collectively elevate the standard of modern man. A rising tide lifts all ships, or should lift all ships. And I looked around and I saw that there was communities for men, but they were either pure business focused, pure fitness focused, or they were recovery communities for people that have issues with drugs and alcohol. I couldn't find any communities that were about facilitating growth across all the important domains of life: biological, psychological, spiritual, and financial. So anyway, I launched Better Man. Initially, it was the retreat, and then out of necessity, we launched a community. And within 48 hours, a few hundred guys had signed up. It's grown arms and legs very naturally. And currently, all it is a number of no-cost to low-cost events in and around Scotland, and we will extend that to down south. For example, our next event is with Martin Perry, who's a Paralympic athlete. The guy has one leg and no arms, but despite this, he managed to last year make it to the Paris Paralympic Games. Unfortunately, he didn't get a medal. He got injured, but he's on his way to take gold at LA in 2028. Humble beginnings, 3 brothers, single parent family, very poorly mother. And we're having an experience with him, a sit down, sharing his story. And then we're going to play table tennis with him. These able-bodied guys playing this disabled guy, although he doesn't perceive himself to be. And some other companies there, Hyper Ice, and we're going to do bodily assessments and stuff like that. And conversation and connection. And I think what I've found is that when you put guys together, communally in a space, a shared challenge, shared experience, novelty, only good things occur. So that's a bit about my why. We launched the retreat, and the retreat is that on steroids. So that's the guys that maybe are doing okay in life and they want to really excel, but for me, the intention is for them to create the conditions to flourish, to future-proof their minds, their bodies, their businesses, their careers. We're bringing in speakers. We've got, a number of incredible speakers, from UFC athletes to business behemoths like Paul Richardson, the former chairman of Gymshark. I'll be performing a double act with Dr. Alka Patel, who, by the way, is a female, and I involved her for 2 reasons. One, she's a female, and I didn't want, it's a male community, I wanted to involve a female because yin and yang, yang and yang, females could be involved in the process of making men better and vice versa. And also she's incredibly gifted when it comes to the art of longevity science. And there's all sorts of other elements to it. It's not just 3 days and done though. We're building resilience groups. We're introducing the guys before, building the bonds during. There's a continuity of that. There's loads of other elements to it. I don't want it to be sounding like a pitch type thing. But yeah, and the goal with that isn't just to serve those men selfishly, it's to create beacons, it's to create role models. It's for them to, yes, benefit their business, their personal lives and their professional lives, but also use those newfound perspectives and frameworks to impact those they love, lead, and their communities to, again, collectively elevate the standard of modern man.
Amazing. Sounds really good. And I think a lot of these men's groups do come from selfish beginnings. It's like, I need these kind of people around me. And I think that's good. And I encourage more men to do that and do that thing. And had a guy on here who was telling us about a group of farmers. They go for a walk, they go with their ferrets. Like that's a niche group, but there's
very
enough
niche.
There's enough of them to
listen, we all need a tribe, we all need someone. I want to, have we got time for me to go back to a particular point? Earlier on we were talking about that whole mollycoddle thing and men being a mess as a result of coming from single parent families, and I came from a single parent family. Look, that's not always the case, right? Because actually, if I look at my scenario, my father had a mother and a father, and if I look at Faye, my other half, I'm together 13 years, not married yet, maybe in time. But if I look at Faye's mother and father, Faye's father, he had a mother and father. And they're still together. And my father's mother and father are still together, despite one of them passing just recently. So it's not necessarily just the result of single parent families. It's actually more so probably the mollycoddling and the prevention. Because these two, if I look at Faye's father, who, by the way, Faye's father was in her life and then rejected her at the age of 16 and just walked out on her and her brother. I look at my dad, he'd done a similar thing just slightly earlier in my life. But there's a lot of similarities, and we've through conversation, we've come to realise that there's a lot of similarities in our fathers. And it's to use that term you used again earlier on, and I forget it, it's men's bodies, boys' brains, boys and men's bodies. And if I look at it, both my father's mother mollycoddled him, wrapped him up in a little blanket, and didn't enable him to take personal responsibility for his actions. And the same was true for Kevin, my other half, Faye's father. His mother wrapped him up in a safety net, mollycoddled him, and didn't allow him to take full responsibility for his actions. Both these men, our parents, my father and my other half's father, they created children.
Yeah.
And their mothers didn't allow them. They walked away from those children, and their mothers and fathers didn't hold them accountable. But the mothers, well, it's the father's fault too, but there's just something in that. And I think, the father should have stepped up too. So it's not, I guess I wanted to mention that because it's not, I don't want to vilify single mothers. My mother was a great single mother, There is some great value in having a mother and a father, but it doesn't always lead to, the perfect male, if you will, or a more well-rounded male.
Yeah, I think to summarize that, just because you're there doesn't mean you're present. So just because the father's in place, it doesn't mean that they're providing any value. You can be a good dad that's in a split up relationship. You can still be a present father in those kind of relationships.
You certainly can.
I think that's sort of the point that you were sort of alluding to, which I agree. Like it's more about the absence of masculinity rather than a man being there, I think.
Do you know what, Lewis, to sum this up, I'm really glad that my dad rejected me, because if he didn't, I would have habits aren't taught, they're caught, and I would have absorbed a lot of his habits. Whereas that rejection, while going through it, I didn't want that to be the case. It pained me and caused me a lot of psychological issues. Now I'm grateful for it because I've had to work through that rejection, but I say that I'm grateful for it. And I'm happy that he wasn't around, because it almost gave me a blank slate to figure out what it is to be me and what it is to be a man. And I had to go on this journey of self-exploration.
Yeah, I like that. Looking back at it and being able to take the positives from a negative, for sure. Ross, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've enjoyed it every second. If people have enjoyed what they've heard and they want to find out more, where's the best place to find you and everything that you do?
You can connect with me on Instagram, the Ross Anderson Official, or Ross Anderson Official on Instagram. I've also just launched beyond_baseline_ on Instagram, but more likely Ross Anderson Official, or if they're on LinkedIn, if they're professional, they can find me on LinkedIn. It's just Ross Anderson, man in the cap, as always.